The season is busy. The time is almost here. The hours left to prepare, or left to wait, grow shorter. And so because there is so much competing for your time and attention this day, and as we go into this next week, I just want to say that I'm glad that you're here today. Can we just take a moment to exhale, to rest in a moment of stillness before we rush back out of here to all the important things we have going on today? Be still, breathe in, breathe out. As you sit here breathing deeply, I wonder if you'll permit me to tell you the story of what I learned when I was struck silent for a time. My name is Zechariah, and I had the honor and privilege of being the father of the one you know as John the Baptist. But there was a time in my life, around the time that John made his way into this world, that I was forced into stillness and silence. I was unable to speak. Now, you may think of that as a punishment. However, although there were a few times when it did feel like a punishment to me, I've come to see this time of enforced silence as a gift. After all, as Socrates once said, the unexamined life is not worth living. It was a gift to me to be forced to slow down, to be forced to pause from the way that life usually works, and to spend some time in reflection. So take some time, breathe deeply, and let me tell you my story. Now, the story I have to tell you is sandwiched between the stories of how Jesus came into the world. But for some reason, the gospel writer Luke, who wrote down my story, begins, first of all, with the announcement of two exceptional births about to come. One, of course, being the reason for the season, Jesus the Messiah, and also the announcement of the birth of my son John. But Luke found it important, after the announcement that these exceptional children would come into the world, to pause before he got to the main attraction. After Mary learns that she's about to become a mother in the most unusual and unexpected way, and she raises her voice and sings a beautiful song about the love of God that rests on the lowly and the unaccounted for, about the love of God exhibited in justice for the downtrodden, instead of rushing right on to the account of the birth of Jesus, complete with the hosts of angels and the witness of the shepherds, Luke pauses for just a moment and narrates the birth of John. And so even though we are all pressed for time, would you pause with me for a moment so I can tell you about the lessons I learned in the silence as I awaited my son's birth. Now, having a child was something that I had always hoped for, something I just always expected would happen in my life. You get married and you have babies. That's what you do. That's the way the world works. And I was married to Elizabeth, and they don't come much better than her, folks. If anyone in this world deserved to have a child, if anyone deserved the noble blessing of motherhood, it was Elizabeth. And I'm sure you've heard about how things were in my day, about how women who did not have children were looked down upon, because if children are a blessing from God and you don't get that blessing, well, what does that say about you? What does it say about me as a man that my wife was unable to have a child? What did it say about us as people? How could we be considered to be upright and God-honoring people if we were not blessed with children? And honestly, while you live in a world that is different than mine, I'm not sure that things have changed all that terribly much. I'm sure you've heard testimonies of multiple people who say that when they're unable to conceive, for whatever reason, whether that's their choice or by tragic circumstance or just the way things are, it's at best viewed with suspicion, at least by some. And in our case, our lack of children was viewed with suspicion and even sometimes hostility. The fact of our lives was that month after month, and then year after year, we looked and looked for signs of new life growing in Elizabeth, but we found none. And we followed every well-meaning family member's advice about how to kickstart that entire process. Occasionally, we even asked those who were versed in the medical field if they had anything that could help us. And my dear Elizabeth swallowed spices and drafts that were rumored to help open up your womb, but none of it helped. None of it worked. And the years stretched into decades, and our hopes of Elizabeth ever falling pregnant began to dim and then fade ever so slowly until our hope was utterly gone. We sat in the darkness and shadow of being unable to conceive, no matter how many times we tried new things, no matter how often we went to the temple and offered our gifts, no matter how much we prayed. And did we ever pray? We prayed until our throats were sore and our eyes were gritty from the tears, but nothing happened. And so that thing that almost everyone else in this world seems to be able to do with ease, even sometimes when they would rather not, we simply couldn't do. And the wagging tongues and the subtle and not so subtle things that people would say, the way they would treat old Aunt Elizabeth and old Uncle Zechariah, or poor Elizabeth, the way that we would be left out of the times when other people bonded over childbearing and raising children, that was at least as difficult for her, for us, as the fact of her empty womb. Surely she was justified a little later in the story when the impossible has happened, and Elizabeth exclaims, "This is what the Lord has done for me when he looked favorably on me and took away the disgrace that I have endured among my people." By the time the story that I am telling you begins, we simply didn't have it in us to hope anymore. We didn't have it in us to utter one more prayer, or light one more candle, or to hope even once more. We were old, both of us. Our bodies had slid slowly from the vitality of youth to the slower moving, more wrinkled versions of middle age, late middle age. And even if we had it in us to hope some more, Elizabeth's body demonstrated all signs of being past able to conceive. What more could we do than just let life go on as we always have and accept this blow dealt to us by life in this sometimes capricious and cruel world? We just moved on. And just when it seemed that everything was lost, when we would live out the rest of our days on this planet under this particular shadow, that's when the angel appeared to me. And that angel's appearance was so unexpected that I was arrested even by the appearance of Gabriel. I was serving in the temple of the time, which even though I am a priest, there are so many people who are priests in my day that we only got to serve our priestly duties twice a year for a week at a time. And in between those 2 weeks a year, I would do other work to supplement our family income and put food on the table. And when it was my turn to serve God in the temple for those 2 precious weeks a year, we would draw lots to see who would be on what duty. And lo and behold, on this particular week of service, the lot fell to me to offer the incense on that altar that is just outside the holiest place of the temple, the Holy of Holies. And let me tell you, that is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. I had never had that privilege before, and I would never get it again. Delighted by my good fortune, by the way that God was smiling on me and giving me the gift of being able to serve him in this way, I wasn't looking for anything else at all. That week might have been the perfect week, one that I would cherish for the rest of my life, even without all the other stuff that happened. I guess that's just the way God works sometimes. It doesn't rain, but it pours, as the saying goes. And so there I am. I'm offering incense in the sanctuary as the people outside waited and offered their own prayers. My heart was full as I performed this service that I had waited my entire life to do. And then the angel appeared and stopped me right in my tracks. Now, I can't put into words for you what it is like to run into an angel of the Lord. They're not those cute little cherubs that you might see in paintings or that you hang on your Christmas trees. This angel was terrifying. A big warrior-like creature with wings. And he's so bright that you can hardly even look at him. I was overwhelmed, nearly undone with fear when this creature appeared there in the sanctuary as I offered the incense. And then, as so often happens when angels from the realms of glory interact with creatures of the earth, his first words to me were, "Do not be afraid, Zechariah." This, I am led to understand, is one of the more common things that God and God's messengers say to people. Don't be afraid. Now, I can't say it did much to still my pounding heart, but the messenger certainly had my attention. And then he told me that my Elizabeth was going to have a son. A son. My Elizabeth. when we were both shriveling from the inside out, when we had long stopped praying, or at least I had, for such a thing to happen, all of a sudden one of heaven's warriors appears to tell us that we're going to have our very own miracle. And although pictures of characters from my people's past, such as Abraham and Sarah, or Rachel, one of Jacob's wives, or Ruth, all of whom had the same kind of trouble with babies that my Elizabeth had, these ancient stories that I had been told from the time I was a small boy, even though those swim through my head at the angel's announcement, the fact is that even though I know that God has visited women who seem past all earthly hope of childbearing in the stories of my people, I still cannot, in that moment, bring myself to believe that this time it would happen for me, for us, for me and Elizabeth. Over the years, I had spent every single hope and prayer that I had in me on that subject. To hope this one more time, only to have that taken away, I didn't think I could bear it again. And so I asked the angel for some sort of sign, some sort of assurance, that some way that I would know that I had not simply fallen asleep or hit my head and was having a very vivid dream there in the temple of the offering of the incense. At this point in my life, it was simply easier not to believe. And so if you find yourself today worn out from hoping for something too much, if you're in a place in your life where when people tell you, well, take heart, or just have a little faith, or just believe and it will happen for you, and you just want to roll your eyes because you cannot quite bring yourself to do those things, well, you have a friend in me, in Zechariah, the father of John the Baptist. And remember, this announcement came to me directly from the lips of an angel, and I still couldn't quite force myself out of the darkness of doubt in that moment. The angel Gabriel told me that I would not be able to speak until I'd seen this child with my own eyes. And when I finally did see the promise from the angel, I could begin to deal with the years of pain and hurt and darkness and believe what the angel told me. But I didn't believe it, not at first. And that is why the angel gave me the gift of silence. And I do see it as a gift because I learned more in those months of imposed silence than I have learned at any other time in my life. One of the more difficult lessons in this world is that it is not through the good times, when life is going well, when you learn the most and grow the most. It's often when walking through our own valleys and shadows that we learn and grow. And the silence that followed the announcement of the angel was one of the most fertile times in my life. In fact, there is a story once told of our great people of old, Moses, from a time when he was about to see the Lord pass him by. And there was a great and mighty wind, followed by an earthquake and then a wildfire. But God was not in any of those things. But in the sheer silence that followed, that sheer and complete silence, that was when Moses was able to finally hear what the Lord had to say to him. I understand that story better now than I ever have. Now that, of course, is an ancient story. In my story, I re-entered the world with the dazzle of the angel's light still burning in my vision, and I discovered that not only were the people out there waiting for me, for I had been detained past when I was expected by that conversation with the angel, but I learned very quickly that what the angel had said had come true. I was completely unable to speak to the people that were gathered there. I had to communicate with the gathered worshipers by sign language, and that was going to be the case going forward for the next few months. I would be unable to speak a word until the other promise from the angel came to be. And in the times in which I could not communicate in the ways that I normally do, I had a lot of time to think, to reflect on the words of the angel, to be sure, but also on the nature of God. Now, you know that I am a priest, and so maybe you think that I always think about these things as just a matter of course. But I'm also not so very different from all the people around me. I think I'm a pretty ordinary guy. When I'm not doing my priestly duties, which, as you remember, is 50 weeks out of the year, I just work an average job. I just do whatever I need to keep us afloat. So I'm not very different from most of you. But when I was forced to stop in my tracks, to deviate from life as normal, I'll tell you, it's a different affair having dinner around a table where all you can do is listen to what everyone else has to say, and you're unable to express your opinion or give your own advice. When I was able to have more time with my thoughts because I couldn't inflict them on anyone else, I was able to reflect, and I discovered the gift in this. Now, it became obvious fairly quickly that Elizabeth was indeed going to have this promised child after all these years. And yet, even when that became obvious, while she whooped with joy with our neighbors and relatives, I had to express my joy silently. Of course, I was overjoyed, but there wasn't that many people I could share it with, except perhaps maybe as I conversed with God, because you don't need a tongue or a throat for that. And in this silent time, most of all, as I reflected on the nature of God, the one who finally brought this joy to Elizabeth, and I can't tell you how beautiful her smile was now that she was swelling with the child that she had prayed and longed for all those years, and this God who brought this joy to me. And here's what I came up with in the silence. I realized, first of all, that God is a God who keeps promises. Now, that promise had been long in coming, to be certain, but that's actually a current that we see in the stories of how God has worked among my ancestors, how God answered the promise of a child to Abraham and Sarah when they were both shriveled with years, just like the baby that my own Elizabeth now carried within her, even though carved on both of our faces are the lines of our many years. The way that God worked in Abraham and Sarah's lives is so close to the way that God worked in ours that I couldn't fail to see the significance. You see, with God, there are no dead ends. God always works through unlikely people. Now, if God wanted to send this particular child, my son John, into the world, he certainly could have found more accessible places than through these two sad and aging people. But God chose us anyway. That was true in the days of Genesis when God was calling on Abraham and Sarah. It was true for Elizabeth and I believe it is true for you too. Where in the world does it seem the most unlikely place that God is going to work? Where are the burned out stumps and the dead ends in your lives? God may yet be at work in those places. Are you paying attention? And the second thing I learned in the silence was this: God comes to us in the darkness. A modern person writes the following: though some would claim that God does not go where God is not wanted, such a claim stands in direct opposition to the claim of Christmas. The claim of Christmas is that God goes where God is not expected and is not wanted. God goes where at one time seemed impossible. God breaks through the cosmos, tears through the curtain, crumbles our dividing walls, and makes the audacious and spectacular claim that God was made flesh. God was a baby. The claim of Christmas is that God broke through the darkness. And when my tongue was finally loosened, when I had that child, here's part of what I said. Because of God's compassion, the dawn from heaven will break upon us, will give light to those sitting in the darkness and in the shadow of death to guide us in the path of peace. Again, from that same writer, through our freedom, humanity has created many dark and terrible places. The shadow of death at times looms large over our world, but in the midst of a darkness, the baby is born. So where do you sense darkness in this world? Where do you sense shadow in your own lives? I know that the world abounds with shadow. It did in my day, and it still does in yours. Shadow is not new to the world, but to the people sitting in the shadows, as I would finally sing out when my tongue was loosened, although the shadow of death looms large, in the midst of the darkness, God comes through, and a baby was born. Well, actually, I would add that 2 babies were born. One, of course, being the child that you are all in a rush to celebrate with all the trappings that brings, and the other being my son, John. Because of my silence, I was also able to see John, not just through the blessing that he would be and already was to his mother Elizabeth and to me, but also through God's eyes, the ways that John would go on to bless the entire world. It's interesting, isn't it, if you're to page through all 4 of your Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, that only 2 of the writers record Jesus' birth, who, of course, is their subject. But all 4 Gospels say that in order to tell the story of Jesus, you have to know a little something about my Johnny, the one you know very formally as John the Baptist. Through God's eyes, I would see the great man that boy would become. When our neighbors far and wide began to wonder about his birth, they asked, "What then will this child become?" And I knew the answer to that. Our child would be a prophet, someone who pointed the way to the fulfillment of God's promise to God's people. John is one of the ways that God is building a bridge from the past to the future, which is represented ultimately in the birth of Jesus, as God's Son came into the world. But when John grew up, he was a great man and a good man in his own right, but he would always choose to point to Jesus rather than taking the glory for himself. And for this reason, if I may be so bold, I think that you are actually missing a figure from most of your nativity sets. To be complete, you need not just the Holy Family, the animals and the manger and the wise men and the shepherds and the angels, but you should probably add a figure to represent my boy, John the Baptist, pointing the way to Jesus. But of course, I am a biased old man who is ridiculously joyful at the birth of his long-awaited son, and so take that as you will. Now it's nearly time for you to get back to your holiday preparations that I have kept you from for this long. But on this fourth Sunday of Advent, perhaps you find yourself in a place not so different from my own at that time. Perhaps you are looking for a faint glimmer of light on the horizon because the full light of dawn has not yet come into your lives. As one writer says, we find ourselves now in between, standing in that moment of the already and the not yet. The light has dawned, but it doesn't seem to have yet reached the deepest darknesses inside us and around us. The truth is that the moment of the already and the not yet is where we find ourselves all of the time. To live the life of a disciple of Christ is to live always in Advent time, knowing that the light has come and still awaiting the light that has yet to shine in its fullest measure. Advent is an anticipatory time, and yet it is also frustrating and sometimes discouraging. The dawning of the light must sustain us as we continue on in our waiting and our living, and sometimes the wait for the rays of Jesus' light upon our faces seems awfully long. My friends, I know something of the agony of waiting for God's promises. I know the days, even the years, and decades often of sorrow that I, alongside Elizabeth, went through. I know the hurt of unanswered prayer. I know the ache of a promise that seems just so very wonderful but remains out of your reach. But perhaps in your own Advent waiting, you can hear some of the lessons that I learned in the silence, lessons that I put into a song when my son John finally made his way into the world and I was able to speak once again. Hear the words that I spoke, the lessons from the silence.
Blessed be the Lord, the God of Israel. He came and set his people free. He set the power of salvation in the center of our lives, and in the very house of David his servant, just as he promised long ago through the preaching of his holy prophets. Deliverance from our enemies and every hateful hand. Mercy to our fathers as he remembers to do what he said he'd do. What he swore to our father Abraham, a clean rescue from the enemy camp, so that we can worship him without a care in the world, made holy before him as long as we live. And you, my child, prophet of the highest, will go ahead of the Master to prepare his ways. Present the offer of salvation to his people, the forgiveness of their sins. Through the heartfelt mercies of our God, God's sunrise will break upon us, shining on those in the darkness, those sitting in the dark shadows of death, and then showing us the way, one foot at a time, down the path of peace.
My friends, the lessons that I learn in the silence is this. God is faithful to keep God's promises, even though they seem to tarry an impossibly long time. And the promise is also that God is merciful and that mercy will one day dawn, will one day give light to those who sit in the darkness, in the shadow of death. Friends, if that is you today, know that God breaks into the world in places that God is not expected and perhaps not even particularly wanted. For it's God's business always to bring new life from dead ends and dried out stumps. And even in the darkest night, it will give way to the glorious dawn. Would you bow with me in prayer as we close? God of the prophets, you sent John into the world to proclaim the coming of your Son. Give us ears to hear the proclamations of your promises and eyes to see your presence in this world. In Jesus' name we pray these things. Amen. As you go this week, be people of love. Let love live in your heart and share the love of Christ with all you meet. Share love by loving those you see regularly. Start by loving your families and your community. Share love by loving those you don't know. How do your actions affect the rest of God's creation? Share love by praying for our world. In this Advent season, we need to see, feel, and share love. As you go out into the wonder of God's creation, share love, joy, peace, and hope with those you meet. Amen. Go in peace.